For all we like to talk about great transit systems around the world, one of the biggest barriers to effective transit is suburban sprawl. This is especially true in the US, but I actually think there's a solution to this problem that lies in what many may see as an unlikely place: Australia. If you aren't already, make sure to follow me on Instagram and especially Twitter, where I share my opinions on transit issues in much more bite-sized chunks. I've given 2 talks at TransitCon in 2 years about regional rail, and while I think it has the potential to be incredibly transformative for actually making areas that haven't traditionally been seen as transit supportive actually pretty accessible via transit. I'm actually also really curious what you think the biggest challenges suburban sprawl creates for transit are, so let me know in the comments down below. Now, one of the greatest benefits of regional rail, especially in North America, where it costs a lot to build transit, is that it can mostly be above ground. And in cases where frequencies aren't incredibly high, level crossings are also probably actually acceptable, especially if the design standards we have for them take a little inspiration from Europe and Asia. That's helpful because grade separations are another one of those things that we aren't really great at building affordably. Another huge benefit of regional rail is that it gives you massive room for ridership growth. You have room for large platforms, which means potentially large trains, and as long as you can have a double track corridor, there's no reason with signaling upgrades and rolling stock upgrades over the years, you can't turn your regional rail system into effectively a mega-sized subway. Basically like some German S-Bahn or Japanese regional rail systems. One of the biggest benefits I see to regional rail over conventional subway and light rail systems that you especially see in the United States, though, is speed. Now, of course, where we draw the line as to what a subway is probably the topic for another video that I may have actually made in the past. But truth be told, subway trains in the US in almost all cases don't actually even get up to highway speeds in the best case scenario. Regional rail trains, on the other hand, usually have no issue going well beyond highway speeds. Now, I think this is a really undervalued element of regional rail, especially in the context of a country like the US. As much as highways are very bad in a lot of cases, the truth is that they do allow for pretty rapid travel across really sprawling urban areas, and they are still actually relatively high capacity. Now, being able to compete in such urban areas with a lot of long trips, and with existing infrastructure that's really conducive to making those long trips, means pulling out all of the stops and advocating for speed more than I even usually do. This is where Australia comes in. Like in the US, people in Australia speak English. Who knew? And as it turns out, Australia has a ton of urban sprawl, and people love their cars. Again, just like in the US. But Australia has something the US doesn't have, and it is not just animals which have a penchant for making your life miserable. Basically every major city in Australia has some form of electric regional rail system, a suburban rail for my Australian viewers. Some of these systems are even very extensive, and generally the trains and infrastructure is really great, stuff that any North American city would love to have. Brisbane is even doing its own little RER tunnel, which I talked about in a previous Demystified video. Now, I will say Australian cities do often struggle with last mile transit, buses, or sometimes pedestrian or cycling networks, but that's something we are seeing improve in various places. It's especially true that if you have a good regional rail network that dives deep into the suburbs, there's no reason you can't connect it up to those suburban housing areas with compelling pedestrian and cycling networks, which works especially well in climates like Australia, but also in a lot of the growing Sunbelt cities in the United States. I'm also a believer, from this video here, that park and rides aren't the end of the world as long as they're kept at the urban fringe, and those could be an option in some areas where you want to bring people living in more rural areas into cities. Such systems are also really good because they tend to focus on the city center, and that nature of creating a dense city center is one of the best ways not only to make transit more effective, but also to start building out a compelling core where people can live without a car. Now, I don't think the Australian model of transit makes sense everywhere, but one of the great things about it is that the cost to move a single passenger tends to be fairly low. And that's a really exciting option for cities in the US that tend to have relatively small transit operating budgets. If you have bigger vehicles on a few key routes, you can operate them more frequently and move a ton of people, which in turn creates a virtuous cycle of more people riding transit and more investment in fringe areas and making transit more successful. And some places in the US are already doing this, like New Jersey, for example, whether it be metros that aren't really metros or seriously cool rail tunnels and actual metro systems. Regional rail also doesn't try to rewrite the history of American cities, and would do relatively well just serving what already exists, rather than hoping that we can change the way we've been operating and suddenly make broad, rapid urban changes. And I'd argue Australia is also a great source for more minor design considerations for the United States as well. Perth, a city I haven't talked about much in this channel, but that's actually super interesting, and we'll definitely get some more videos in the future, is one of those really interesting examples. It uses trains which often travel down the middle of highways, again, not that dissimilar from some systems in the United States. Using mainline trains and highway medians quite extensively would be a great model to export to the United States, where, for better or for worse, a lot of development is centered along highway corridors. And while some of those corridors are sometimes used by light rail in places like Denver and Seattle, heavier rail has more potential here because it can frankly just go much faster in these relatively straight and flat corridors. Another pretty solid example of transit design that I see in Australia is their way of doing air rail links, which is very different from what you see in the US. To be clear, Toronto has done this with the Up Express, but not with electrified trains. And the thing I find most interesting is that when you compare Brisbane with Los Angeles, both cities which will be doing Summer Olympics in the future, downtown city center, which a lot of events will actually be happening around, you're going to have to take 3 trains, whereas in Brisbane, it'll just be 1. At the same time, there's no reason you can't reshape your city around regional rail. One of the greatest examples of transit-oriented development in the English-speaking world is probably Chatswood in Sydney, and that allows people to make most of their daily trips without ever needing a car or any kind of other fossil-fueled powered transit. And I think that really needs to be the focus. Even some of the most transit-oriented societies in the world still do have some cars. So if we can use models from Australia to help make cities in the US and in North America more broadly car light, that would be a huge win. Thanks for watching.